Good morning, and I'm thankful for the opportunity to bring a message to you all this morning. And I've been looking in the book of First Samuel, chapter 30, this week, and thinking about what the Lord might have for us out of that passage. The title of this morning's message, as you've already seen at this point, is Encourage Yourself. And the title certainly looks like this would be some kind of a self-help message, perhaps. And that's not what this is. It's not a self-help message. Um, it's also not an attempt to criticize those who are in need of encouragement. Sometimes I think we look at people who need encouragement and we can be a little harsh. Say, why don't you just get your act together, kind of pull yourself together and make it happen? Well, again, that's not what this message is either. Despite the title, it's not about that. Um, it's not about trying to convince you that everything that you need is already right inside of you. Those kind of self-help messages sometimes that we hear from people, you really are a princess, and you just need to acknowledge that to make you feel better. That's not what this message is about. It's not a self-help message. It's not a criticism of people who really need encouragement. And many times that's where we find ourselves. Um, so it's not about discovering what a wonderful person you truly are. No, really, what this message is meant to do, what I hope it'll do, is to help us deal with a reality that we really find ourselves in from time to time. Um, the situation where you may feel, and it may be true, that I am really alone. I'm truly alone. There's no one here to encourage me. I don't know what to do. I don't know how to overcome the circumstance that I'm going through, or if there's any way to do that. And this is a situation that we've been in, where we've been discouraged, where I've been discouraged, and it doesn't seem that there's anybody there that can help us or that is willing to help us. There's nobody there to care for our soul. And that's what this message is for. This is to help us, to help me, to help you in that time when we stand desperately in need of encouragement. And the situation that we're looking at this morning is a time when David was there. David was in that position where he needed encouragement. What can we do? Well, we can do what David did. Let's look back down at our text in First Samuel chapter 30 and verses 1 through 6. I'm going to read these verses for you again. It says, "And it came to pass, when David and his men were come to Ziklag on the third day, that the Amalekites had invaded the south and Ziklag, and smitten Ziklag, and burned it with fire, and had taken the women captives that were therein. They slew not any, either great or small, but carried them away, and went on their way. So David and his men came to the city, and behold, it was burned with fire, and their wives, and their sons, and their daughters were taken captive. Then David and the people that were with him lifted up their voice and wept until they had no more power to weep. And David's two wives were taken, Ahinoam the Jezreelitess, and Abigail the wife of Nabal the Carmelite. And David was greatly distressed. For the people spake of stoning him, because the soul of all the people was grieved, every man for his sons and for his daughters. But David encouraged himself in the Lord his God." David encouraged himself in the Lord his God. I want us to find how we can be encouraged today. So a little background here. David has been living for a while now in a city called Ziklag. This is actually in the land of the Philistines. He finally really had gotten tired of running from Saul. In fact, the Bible records for us when he said to himself, "Listen, this isn't any good running from Saul all the time. Eventually he's going to catch up with me and he's going to kill me." So David, interestingly, goes to a city called Gath, actually the hometown the hometown of Goliath. You may remember the Bible said he was Goliath of Gath. Well, that's the place where David goes, and he joins himself to the king of Gath, who is a man named Achish. And after living with Achish for a while, Achish gives him a city to live in. That's this place called Ziklag. And David's now been living there for about a year and 4 months. Now, just recently, Achish and the other lords of the Philistines had decided that they were going to go do battle against the nation of Israel, against King Saul. And David and his men initially are going to go along with King Achish and the Philistines to this battle. Now, what David intended to do if he ended up in that battle, I have no idea. The Bible doesn't tell us. But the lords of the Philistines looked at David and said, maybe he shouldn't be coming with us. This is the same one who killed Goliath, and if he goes with us to battle, then this is going to be a perfect opportunity for him to make peace with King Saul and turn against us. So King Achish sent David home. David and his men return home. It's about a 3 days journey. He returns home, and what does he find? Well, his city of Ziklag, where he lived, where his men and their families had lived, had been burned by fire, and these Amalekites had taken away his family and the families of all of his men captive. Now, I don't know if you can imagine a more dire circumstance, a more difficult circumstance, or a more discouraging circumstance than what David and his men are facing right now. And as if it wasn't enough that David's family and his belongings, possessions have been taken away, his men blame him, and to the point that they're ready to stone him. They said, David, this is your fault. This would never have happened if it was not for you. And they're saying we should just stone him and be done with this. This is all his fault. So David, as you can imagine, is discouraged. His men are discouraged. In fact, as we just read, they were so discouraged that they wept and cried to the point that they couldn't cry anymore. Their strength to even cry and to weep any longer was gone. This is truly the depth of despair and discouragement that they are in, and David is the one that they're blamed. So here David is. He's lost a lot, and his men have turned on him. What is he going to do? How is he going to respond in this time of discouragement? Well, as we just read in verse 6, the Bible tells us that David encouraged himself. I want to see some things about that as we go on. Now, when we are discouraged, when you're discouraged or when I am discouraged, we have some places that we often go to looking for encouragement. I'm going to mention some of those as we go along here. And one of the first things perhaps that gives us encouragement, or just at least one of the things that gives us encouragement sometimes when we feel discouraged is our things, our possessions, our financial situation, our personal belongings many times can provide us a sense of security, a sense of comfort. When things are going badly, perhaps we can look and say, well, hey, at least there's money in the bank account. At least I know that I can provide for my needs and I can provide for my family. Yes, I'm going through a time of discouragement, but I have some personal belongings, some possessions that I can kind of find some security in. At least I still have my house. At least I still have a reliable vehicle. At least I still have, again, a full bank account or a retirement account or whatever. And you look and you can say, there are still some things that I can look at and find encouragement and a sense of security. Well, David didn't have that at this point. David is looking at a burned out city. Somewhere in that city was his house. His house was there where his possessions were, where his belongings were. In the previous chapters, his men had been making some raids on some enemy cities. They'd collected some spoil. Prior to this, he was in a position of some financial security. He had his belongings and these things that could have given him some amount of comfort. But as David looks at his city now, it's a burned out husk. His home was empty and his possessions were gone. Now that place of security and of comfort was taken away from him. He didn't have that. His material wealth, his possessions had been stolen. They had been taken away. His stuff wasn't there to encourage him. His wife also wasn't there to encourage him. One of the beautiful encouragements that God has given to many of us in life is our spouse, our husband or our wife. And we find ourselves in a time where we're so discouraged, where we have lost things, where things have been taken away from us violently, perhaps, and where our health is broken, or where we're struggling with one thing or another. And God has sent a wonderful spouse, a wife or a husband, that comes alongside us and puts their arm around us and says, "Honey, it's all right. It's going to be okay. I'm here for you." And we receive such great encouragement from that. I'm blessed with a wife like that who encourages me, who helps me when I'm discouraged. And God's blessed us in that way. But as we look at David here, his wife was taken away from him. Here his men were, they'd turned their back on him, and the place he might naturally have turned for comfort to his wife, well, that was taken away also. There was no wife there to come alongside David and say, "It's going to be okay. Let me encourage you. Let me put my arms around you and let you know that I still love you." She wasn't there. David didn't know where she was. He didn't know whether she was dead. He didn't know whether she was alive. He had no comfort in that position where often he may have sought comfort and encouragement. His wife was gone. She wasn't there. His wives were gone. They were dead for all he knew. And that source of comfort was stripped away from him. His children weren't there to encourage him. Our children can be a source of encouragement, can't they? I'm so grateful for the 4 kids that God has blessed our family with. And they can be naughty and misbehaved at times, and they can be a source of discouragement, I know, for many of us at times. But sometimes they can be such a great source of encouragement. I know I've spoken to many of you who have been encouraged about how your children have turned out, or have had them turn around and say, "Thank you, Mom. Thank you, Dad, for how you raised us." And even with little kids that I have, they can see sometimes when we're discouraged and when we're having difficulty, and when your child comes and climbs up in your lap and puts their arms around you, what a wonderful place of encouragement that can be, even when things are going difficult and going hard. But again, David didn't have that. His children, likewise, I believe he did have some children at this point, and you know what? They've been taken away captive as well. And again, he didn't know whether they lived or whether they were dead at that point. David's discouraged. We look and we have these places of encouragement, and David didn't have access to those usual sources of comfort. Again, his stuff wasn't there. His wife wasn't there. His children weren't there. His friends weren't there. Many times we will look at our friends for help, and thank God for the friends that God sends our way. And many times it is our friends who come along and who help us. David had his mighty men, and we can remember some specific times that the Bible told us that when David was discouraged, his mighty men came along and strengthened and helped him. In one particular time, you remember David said, "Oh, I wish I could have a drink from the well that is at Bethlehem." And 3 of his mighty men, at great personal risk, broke through the enemy lines and brought him back a drink of water from the well at Bethlehem. You can think about the amount of encouragement he must have derived from his friends. For many of them, his godly Christian friends who came along and encouraged him at various times when he was running from King Saul. He had these friends that came along and encouraged him. Well, once again, here David is, and those Christian friends, those friends who'd encouraged him at times in the past, they were nowhere to be found. They were dealing with their own discouragement, their own trials, their own difficulty. They were worried about their own families. They were worried about their children and their wives, and they were distraught to the point that, far from coming to encourage David, they were angry at David. They were questioning his leadership. They were ready to kill David, to stone him. And so that source of encouragement, again, was taken away from David. His friends, we're going to put it this way, his church, We can find a source of strength and a source of encouragement in church. When we have times of discouragement, we can go to the house of the Lord. One of the Psalms says, I was glad when they said unto me, let us go into the house of the Lord. But David was, you might think of it this way, was really banished from the Lord's house at that time, which was the tabernacle. He couldn't go there. He could not go to the tabernacle to go to the place of God's, in that time, his visible presence. David couldn't go there. He wouldn't have been allowed. He would have put his life in danger by going there. And even if that was available to him, he was very far away. And even as this morning we're sitting at home, most of us, and watching the service, and really because of COVID-19 right now, that source of encouragement has been taken from us as well. Our opportunity and our ability to come into the Lord's house and to receive encouragement. No, you've been forced to stay at home, and some of us have been on lockdown for a while, and that's not a particularly encouraging place to be. And that's been denied to us, as that source of encouragement was denied to David. And so he couldn't find encouragement there. He couldn't find encouragement from his personal belongings, which had been stolen. He couldn't find encouragement from his wife, who had been captured. He couldn't find encouragement from his children, who again had been stolen away, from his friends who had turned on him, from his church, if you want to think of it that way, and going into the presence of the Lord in that way for him. He couldn't do that. And not only that, but his wisdom, you could put it this way, his wisdom wasn't there to encourage him. Sometimes we can deal with and we can bear hardship and difficulty when we can look at the decisions that led up to the troubles that we're facing. We can say, listen, I did all I could. Every decision that I made, I can look at, I can analyze it, I can examine it, and from every light, I did exactly what God wanted me to do. There's nothing I could have done differently and brought about a different outcome. And we can find maybe at least a small amount of encouragement from knowing that we made all the right choices leading up to where we are today. But even in that area, David could not do that. His wisdom wasn't there, and his right choices weren't there for him to look at as a source of encouragement for him. In fact, he had chosen to go and live with the Philistines. He had chosen to go to Gath, to Achish's court. Achish had given him this city of Ziklag. He was living in this city. His family was there as a direct result of his decision to leave Israel in a desire for safety in the land of the Philistines, in the land of the enemy. He had gone and ingratiated himself to the enemies of Israel. His family, his friends, his fortune, they had all been placed in jeopardy and were subsequently taken due to his own leadership, and you may say his own poor decision making, perhaps his failure to trust that God would protect him while remaining in the land of Israel. Again, we can find some measure of comfort when we can look at our decisions and say, hey, I did everything right. This is out of my control. But here, David perhaps, I have no doubt, looked at the decisions that led up to this situation for him and said, this is my fault. This is my leadership, my lack of wisdom and right decision making that has brought about all of this difficulty for me and the people that I care about. Man, it's tough when a situation occurs which we can connect directly to our own bad decisions, and especially when that situation affects those that we love and those who are close to us. So here's David. Do you feel discouraged? It almost feels discouraging just talking about it. All the places he normally may have found and sought for encouragement were gone from him. His family, his friends, his church, his wisdom, his own leadership and decision making. No, none of those things were there to discourage him. or to encourage him, excuse me. What was David to do? How could David be encouraged? If you or if I were sitting there in David's situation at that time, our strength gone from crying, from weeping, our friends having turned their backs on us, what would you do? Oh boy, I can only imagine the discouragement, the pain. What could he do? Well, an answer to that question, there was really only one thing he could do. There's only one place he could go, only one place that he could turn. And you know what? That's where he went. David found a way to strengthen and to encourage himself in the absence of all of the usual sources of comfort. With all of those things gone, he availed himself of a resource, of something that he had sadly neglected. He availed himself of a source of strength that he had up till then neglected, but which had been available to him the entire time. I titled this message, Encourage Yourself, but you know what? David couldn't encourage himself. He couldn't pick himself up by his own bootstraps. David didn't need to somehow just suck it up and deal with it. That wasn't the solution here. That wasn't going to give him what he needed. But he could tap into an inexhaustible source of strength, source of help, and a source of encouragement. In fact, Psalm 27 and verse 10 expresses it beautifully. David wrote these words when he said, "When my father and my mother forsake me, then the Lord will take me up." All along, David and you and I have access to a wonderful source of strength and encouragement. An inexhaustible source of strength, of help. And we can tap into that in our greatest moments of discouragement. You know where David encouraged himself? Do you know where he found encouragement? The verse says for us, it says, "But David encouraged himself in the Lord." In the Lord. And as you look down in your text, if you have your Bibles in front of you, as we look there in verse number 6, you'll notice that the verse there, it says that David encouraged himself in the Lord. And if your Bible looks like mine, as I'm sure it does, you'll notice that the word Lord, L-O-R-D, is given there in all caps, or in drop caps, perhaps. And when we find that in the Old Testament, we understand that the word that's being used there in the Hebrew is Jehovah. And I don't believe it is a coincidence at all. In fact, I know that it's not, that particular title of Jehovah is what is used there. When David encouraged himself, he encouraged himself in the Lord. Who was it that could strengthen and encourage David at this time? Well, it was the covenant-making, covenant-keeping God of Israel. That's how that word Jehovah is used. This is the unique, personal term of the nation of Israel for God, Jehovah. The covenant-making God. The God who had made promises to them. The God who had kept his promises. This is the God that David turned to. And of course, as we look at David, you may remember that he had already been anointed king by Samuel. God had made a promise to David already that he was going to be king. And as David looked around him at the faces of his friends, which were now against him, when he looked at all the trouble that was surrounding him, he remembered that there was a covenant-keeping God, Jehovah God, who was there to give him encouragement. 1 Chronicles 16:23-29 says this, "Sing unto the Lord all the earth, show forth from day to day his salvation. Declare his glory among the heathen, his marvelous works among all nations. For great is the Lord, and greatly to be praised. He also is to be feared above all gods, for all the gods of the people are idols. But the Lord made the heavens. Glory and honor are in his presence. Strength and gladness are in his place. Give unto the Lord, ye kindreds of the people. Give unto the Lord glory and strength. Give unto the Lord the glory due unto his name. Bring an offering and come before him. Worship the Lord in the beauty of holiness. You see, when David turned to the Lord, he turned to Jehovah, the covenant-keeping, promise-keeping, all-powerful God, the one who had all the strength that was required, the one who was deserving of all the glory that we could give to him, of all the praise that we can lift up to his name. That was the God that David was turning to. When David had no other source of encouragement, he knew where he could turn. He could turn to the Lord. There's a hymn titled, Jesus, Lover of My Soul. It has some beautiful words in it. In fact, verse 2 says this, Other refuge have I none. Hangs my helpless soul on thee. Leave me not alone. Still support and comfort me. All my trust on thee is stayed. All my help from thee I bring. Cover my defenseless head with the shadow of thy wing. David realized that it was the lover of his soul. It was the Lord Jehovah that he could turn to. When there was no other refuge, when he was helpless, when he was without support and comfort, he knew where to turn. And listen, if we are sitting in a position like that, in a place of discouragement, in a place without comfort and without hope, we can sing that very same hymn that says, Other refuge have I none, but Jesus, the lover of my soul. David turned to the Lord when he encouraged himself. He didn't encourage himself in himself. He didn't encourage himself in his friends. He didn't encourage himself in his wife. He didn't encourage himself in his belongings or in his possessions. He encouraged himself in the Lord. When every other source of refuge fails, there is an all-powerful, unchanging God sitting on the throne of eternity, and he is sitting ready to give us help. Remember what Hebrews 4 and verse 16 says, Let us therefore come boldly unto the throne of grace, that we may obtain mercy and find grace to help in time of need. You may remember that grace is God giving us something good that we do not deserve. And when we stand with David, he didn't deserve the refuge and the strength that he needed from God. In reality, I think we could say that it was his decision making that had landed him and his men in this situation. But David remembered where he could receive unmerited favor or grace, and that was at the throne of God. When we need refuge and help, we can come boldly to the throne of grace to obtain mercy and to find grace to help in time of need. Help is promised in the time of need, in the time of discouragement. Psalm 27 and verse 5 says this, For in the time of trouble he shall hide me in his pavilion. In the secret of his tabernacle shall he hide me. He shall set me up upon a rock. What words of comfort those are. When it seems that the ground under our feet is moving and shifting, that all other ground is sinking sand, God puts our feet on a rock. In the time of trouble, he hides us in his pavilion, in a place of refuge where he is protecting us. In the secret of his tabernacle, the place of his presence, is where he hides and protects us. He sets our feet on a solid foundation. So David encouraged himself. He encouraged himself in the Lord. He encouraged himself in the Lord his God. And that's the last point, his God. This is where it gets personal. David's discouragement was very personal. His friends, his family, his possessions, everything he lost was intensely personal. And the kind of encouragement that he stood in need of was a personal encouragement also. Generic, general encouragement was not going to do. Generic encouragement from a generic God, that was not what David needed. The God that David sought for encouragement was a personal God. It was the God with whom David had a personal relationship. This was not just Abraham's God, not just Isaac's God, not just Jacob's God. This was not just the covenant-keeping God of the nation of Israel, but this was David's God. This was David's personal God. This was a God with whom David had a close and very personal relationship. This was his God. David encouraged himself in the Lord, his God. This is who we need in discouragement. We need a God that we know. We need a God that knows us. We need a God who is personal to us. Nothing and no one else will do. We can accept no substitutes. We need a personal God. And when David was in a point of deep discouragement, David went to his God. Psalm 3 and verse 3 says this, "But thou, O Lord, art a shield for me, my glory, and the lifter up of mine head." When, like David, my head is hanging low in sorrow, in trouble, I need my God to lift up my head. That's what David experienced. David's head was sinking low that day, wasn't it? All of his normal sources of encouragement were gone. But that's when he turned to the Lord, his God. And the Lord encouraged him. The Lord lifted his head and helped him. Can I say to you, if Jesus Christ is not your God, then you are missing the greatest source of encouragement and strength available to mankind. You are missing out on a source of encouragement that will never fail you. Though all around may go wrong and all those sources of encouragement may be gone from you, if Jesus Christ is your God, then you have a source of encouragement that is always available. It is an inexhaustible source, a source that is always available. We always have the ability to be encouraged if we will turn to the Lord our God, who is Jesus Christ. Do you have a personal relationship with him today? Do you know Jesus Christ? Does he know you? Boy, what a wonderful thing it is to be able to have someone always there to give you encouragement when you need it. Someone you can always trust when everyone else has turned their back on you, to have a place that you can turn to and find help and find grace. Do you know him? Do you have a personal relationship with him? Do you have fellowship with Jesus Christ on a daily basis? Oh, I hope that you do. If you do not, then turn to Jesus Christ today. He loves you. John 3:16 tells us that God so loved the world that he sent his only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in him should not perish, but have everlasting life. If you know him, you have access. You can tap into that resource of Jesus Christ, who is your God, and the greatest source of encouragement that we could ever have. If he is your God, then why are you searching for strength and encouragement anywhere else except for the true source of help and strength? One of the tragic statements in the Bible is what God said of his people. He said that they have forsaken me the fountain of living water, and have hewed them out cisterns, broken cisterns which can hold no water. In other words, when they needed the life-giving power of water, rather than having a fountain there that they could turn to for that strength, they had made themselves their own water canisters, so they could carry it with them wherever they went. But those water canisters were broken and were unable to hold water. They had abandoned the source of real strength and had sought for themselves a false source of strength that couldn't help them. Listen, if we stand in need of encouragement, let's go to the source of all encouragement, which is Jesus Christ. Let's not go looking in other places for sustenance, for strength, for help, but turn to the source of all help, which is Jesus Christ, the fountain of living water. When David was alone and discouraged, he knew where to turn for help, and he received it. He got it. The people spoke of stoning David, and he was discouraged. What did he do? Well, David encouraged himself in the Lord, his God, and he found encouragement. In fact, if we pick up, how does the story end? What happens next? Well, verse 6 concluded, as we read, that David encouraged himself in the Lord his God, and then verse 7 continues, and it says, "And David said to Abiathar the priest, Ahimelech's son, I pray thee, bring me hither the ephod. And Abiathar brought thither the ephod to David, and David inquired at the Lord, saying, Shall I pursue after this troop? Shall I overtake them? And he answered him, Pursue, for thou shalt surely overtake them, and without fail recover all." Now again, this is after David had already encouraged himself, but he gets even more encouragement as God responds to his request and his inquiry and said, I'm going to give you all of it back. All of it. Your things, your wives, your children, you're going to get it all back. And in addition, if we were to continue reading, we'd find that David received also great spoil for his men as well in addition. And as if that weren't enough, if we were to go even really a little bit further, we'd find that David right now is sitting on the threshold of great victory. Within just a matter of a few days, perhaps weeks, David is going to be crowned king in Hebron and eventually king over all Israel. So he's sitting at the cusp of great victory. But does any of that ever happen if David didn't choose to encourage himself in the Lord his God? God gave him the encouragement and the strength that he needed. And also, all afterwards, by the way, David was able to encourage those around him. You know, those friends who had turned on him, eventually they're going to receive encouragement from David and from David's God as well. Not only is David going to be helped, but his friends, his family, they're going to be helped as well. You know, it's wonderful, isn't it, when others come to encourage us? It is. And strengthen us and help us. And we need that so much. But you know, there are times when God alone is the encouragement that is available to us, and God alone is the encouragement that we need. You know, he is revealed to us in Scripture in such a way that we are reminded of his power, of his compassion, and of his love. In the time of trouble, when all other encouragements fail, our very personal God will lift us up and strengthen us for our encouragement and ultimately for the encouragement of others also. Like David, encourage yourself in the Lord your God today. Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you for the privilege that is ours to come into your presence, to know you, to have a very personal God who loves us, cares for us, and will encourage us when no other encouragement is there. When our father and mother forsake us, there is a God whom we know, who loves us, and who will take us up in his arms and care for us, and encourage us, and lift up our heads. Lord, may we rely wholly on you. In Jesus' name, Amen.